The wilderness is a beautiful place, but it's also entirely indifferent to your survival. When you're miles away from the nearest paved road, the silence of the woods can start to feel less like peace and more like a predatory trap. I learned this the hard way 3 years ago during a solo backpacking trip through the dense, rain-soaked forests of the Pacific Northwest. I had hiked nearly 12 miles that day and set up my tent in a small, natural clearing near a dry creek bed. By 10:00 p.m., the only thing keeping the darkness at bay was the flickering orange glow of my dying campfire. I was sitting on a fallen log, finishing a meal when the forest went completely, unnaturally silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no owls, just a heavy, suffocating stillness that made my ears ring. Then the silence was shattered by a slow, deliberate snap. It was the sound of a heavy branch, thick as a man's wrist, breaking about 20 yards behind my tent. I froze, the hair on my neck standing up. I grabbed my high-lumen flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the wall of cedar and fir trees. The light hit a pair of eyes reflecting back at me, but they weren't at the level of a deer or a mountain lion. They were high, incredibly high, at least 7 or 8 feet off the ground. As my eyes adjusted to the glare, the beam settled on him. It was a man, or something that looked like one. He was impossibly tall, skeletal, and wearing what looked like a tattered, filth-covered suit that hung off his frame like rags. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing there, partially obscured by a thin pine tree, staring directly at my campsite with an unblinking, predatory intensity. "Hey, I'm armed. Stay back," I yelled, my voice cracking with a fear I couldn't hide. I wasn't actually armed, but I hoped the lie would buy me time. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he started to tilt his head slowly from left to right in a rhythmic, mechanical motion that looked like a bird sizing up a worm. Then he took a step forward. He didn't walk like a human. His limbs moved with a jerky, twitching motion, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I didn't wait for a second step. I grabbed my car keys and my phone, abandoned $800 worth of gear, and sprinted 2 miles back to the trailhead in total, suffocating darkness. When I returned the next morning with a skeptical park ranger, my campsite looked like a war zone. My tent had been shredded into ribbons from the inside out, but the detail that truly broke me was sitting right in the center of the clearing. My own toothbrush had been taken from my bag and snapped perfectly in half, laid out on a flat rock like a ritualistic warning. I haven't been camping since. My girlfriend and I were camping in a popular state park in Northern California. We usually prefer deep wilderness, but we decided on a developed campground for a relaxing weekend. We chose a spot at the very edge of the loop, bordered by a steep, densely wooded ravine that dropped off into a dark valley below. Around 2:45 a.m., I was pulled from a deep sleep by a faint, rhythmic scratching sound. It sounded like a dry fingernail dragging slowly down the nylon rainfly of the tent. Scritch, scritch, scritch. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a low-hanging branch or maybe a curious raccoon looking for scraps. But then, the moon shifted behind a cloud, and a massive shadow fell across the side of the tent. The moonlight was just bright enough to reveal the silhouette of a large, human hand pressed firmly against the fabric. The fingers were long, and the nails looked jagged and broken. The person outside wasn't trying to break in. Not yet. They were slowly, methodically feeling their way around the perimeter of the tent, as if they were trying to map out exactly where our bodies were lying inside. I nudged my girlfriend awake, covering her mouth with my hand before she could gasp. We sat there in paralyzed terror, watching that hand move toward the front entrance. We heard the tiny, metallic clink of the zipper being gripped by steady fingers. Very slowly, an inch at a time, the tent flap began to open. A sliver of the cold night air rushed in. "Who the hell is out there?" I screamed at the top of my lungs, kicking the front of the tent with all my force. There was a startled, guttural gasp, followed by the sound of heavy boots scrambling and sliding down the steep embankment of the ravine. I grabbed my bear spray and a hunting knife, unzipping the tent to look out, but the ravine was a pit of blackness. They were gone. The next morning, we found something that made our stomachs turn. Tucked into the bushes right behind our tent was a small, handheld shaving mirror propped up on a rock. It had been angled perfectly so that someone sitting in the shadows of the ravine could see directly through the mesh roof of our tent. Someone hadn't just been trying to get in. They had been watching us sleep for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to move. I was camping deep in the desert of southern Utah, miles away from any marked trail or water source. The stars out there are so bright they almost feel artificial, but the isolation can play tricks on your mind. I had just finished my dinner and was dousing my fire when I heard a sound that didn't belong in the desert: whistling. It wasn't a random tune. It was a cheerful nursery rhyme melody, echoing perfectly off the canyon walls. It was completely out of place in a wasteland at midnight. I looked up at the canyon rim, about 50 feet above me, and saw a figure silhouetted against the massive moon. They were sitting on the very edge of the cliff, swinging their legs back and forth like a bored child. I waved my lantern, thinking it was a lost hiker. "Hey, you all right up there?" I called out. The figure didn't wave back. The whistling didn't stop. They just sat there, swinging their legs, looking down at my tiny campsite. I retreated into my tent, feeling a cold knot of dread form in my chest. I stayed awake, clutching my knife. About an hour later, the whistling abruptly stopped. Then came the sound of sliding shale and loose rocks. Someone was climbing down the cliff face, and they were coming fast. The footsteps eventually reached the flat ground and approached my tent. They stopped right outside the mesh window. I could hear them breathing, heavy, wet, ragged breaths that sounded like they were struggling for air. Then the whistling started again. But this time, it was right against the fabric of the tent, mere inches from my ear. "I know you're awake," a high-pitched feminine voice whispered. The tone was playful but wrong. "I can smell the sweat on your skin. It smells like copper and salt. Can I come in?" Pure survival instinct took over. I plunged my hunting knife through the tent fabric at the height of where the voice was coming from. I heard a sharp, inhuman shriek, not a scream, but a high-pitched sound like metal grinding on metal. Then came the sound of something heavy sprinting away into the rocks. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a boulder until the sun rose. When the light finally touched the ground, I saw a trail of fluid leading away from my tent. It wasn't red blood. It was a thick, dark, iridescent blue liquid, oily and foul-smelling. I didn't follow the trail. I packed my bags and ran until I reached the highway. I don't go to the desert anymore. Some things out there aren't looking for water, they're looking for us. The great outdoors is a vast, beautiful mystery, but sometimes it's a mystery that's better left unsolved. If you have a true horror story from your own travels or a night spent in the wild, send it to the email in the description. I'd love to share it with the world. If these stories left you feeling a little less alone in the dark, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to Whispered Night Stories. Your support keeps the campfire burning and ensures you never miss a new nightmare. Until next time, keep your tent zipped tight and watch the tree line.